Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Information Bottleneck podcast. And today we have a very special guest and a good friend. This is Tal Kachman, and he is an assistant professor at Radboud University. Um, Welcome, Tal. Thank you
Thank you.
to
It's
join us.
awesome being here. I'm a great admirer of the podcast. Short but strong.
Thank you, and welcome back, Ellen.
Yeah, always happy to be here, and I have cleared whatever gunk was in my eye for the second half of that last episode. So sorry to anybody who was irritated watching me trying that with our previous guest. But yeah, really happy to be on again to talk about AI news.
Yeah. So let's say we'll start again with OpenAI and how they are making deals with hardware companies.
Yeah. Yeah, there's terms like counterparty risk that are being thrown around, right? Around like Oracle, OpenAI, Oracle, AMD, and OpenAI, sorry, AMD, etc.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think like this week, OpenAI just said that they will get 10% of AMD, right? And AMD stock price just went up like crazy, of course. And this is again like we are talking about it every week. Nvidia, OpenAI agreements, and Nvidia and the OpenAI Oracle agreement, right? That, by the way, I just saw an article that it looks that there were a lot of difficulties and challenging Oracle, like that they try like they will sell to Nvidia. They will sell chips to Nvidia. Sorry, they will buy chips from Nvidia, but it will be in much lower price than they expected. So they barely earn money out of this deal.
It's like limit cycles in money space, right? Like they say they barely like sort of like net like earn money, but it sort of goes in this vicious cycle. And like we can talk a lot about volatility and how much like it actually have this kind of ancillary effects of, net at the end of the day, maybe they won't make a lot of money, but just from like slashing it from side to side and like just sort of like transferring it from one pocket to another and stimulating the sector and then driving more activity. It has even its own sort of merit. And it's very interesting to see just a small other anecdote on it is that, like, for example, this also comes head in head with the fact that China sort of decided to like, all right, like we're not using any more like Western chips, like we're all sort of trying to do everything ourselves and stuff like that. Actually, as sort of like a counter effect, right? Because the Chinese markets or economy sort of like loves stability. They don't like these like massive waves of vol and usage because again, that's sort of like control um and in a good way. So I mean, like to me, that was also super interesting. The same with like what was it now? Nvidia sort of like starting to also invest as part of like XAI, if I remember I saw it correctly this time.
I do want
Yeah,
to. Oh, I just wanted to say one thing, which is that DeepSeek, I think that they claimed that their model release got delayed a little bit because of that initial requirement to use exclusively Huawei chips to do like training. And finally, they got to a compromise, which is that they're still allowed to use NVIDIA, at least for now, for training, but inference to be Huawei. So I claim mainland China's demand for high-end NVIDIA GPUs, and in particular, their demand to
It's gone.
probably, get around export controls is not going away, just to be clear.
No, you cannot, right? Like, but that's always been some of the problems, benefits, pluses and minuses of sort of like sectors that are driven by deep tech. It's the fact that sort of time to market and time to innovation is so big that it's so dominated by like momentum if you started early, that these big players in a sense sort of there is a very erosion between the fine line of when are they contributing to the markets and to the field and when are they actually driving them, going back into this era of like scale first that we live in, right? So there's a lot to be said about that actually. Like I'm very interested seeing where it will sort of push now in the future.
yeah, and I think it's not clear like how like where the bubble is, right? And like how big is it, right? Like it's not clear how much we all know that at the end everyone are using AI and everyone wants to use AI, but it's not clear what is the benefit and where and when it's useful. And So we all know that OpenAI, like, it's a great PR machine, right? Like,
Yeah.
did you see that they prices, like, they send some like this
Yeah.
pictures where for people that spend 1 trillion tokens in the last year? Like, they published a list of all the
What?
people that spend a lot of tokens in the last year. And actually, it's quite funny because they are like, of course, there are CEOs or right,
Yeah.
or co-founders of companies that probably like they just like all the tokens are on their name, and but all the company actually use it. But they are like individual people, in some company. I don't know, someone that is like a software engineer in a company or something like that that spent 1 trillion tokens. It's
No, it's
crazy.
insane. And you have this feature, like if you look at their YouTube channel activity in the last like 3 months, 4 months, like the amount of content they're pumping out, it's not just like pure OpenAI, but sort of like working with developers, contributing to this community, right? Like they are pushing this narrative very, very, very strong.
Yeah, and I think it's also related to Server 2.
Yeah,
Like, so last week, Server 2, OpenAI released Server 2, and everyone talked about it, right? At least
yeah,
on Twitter and LinkedIn and things like that. And they frame it as something that you can, like, you generate videos, short videos for social media, right? And I think, again, like, the base model is not better than, I don't know,
Sora one.
Genie, right? Like, they really good, but they are not so good that they are just don't see anyone. But I think they really know how to frame it. They really know how to do a good PR. They really know what are the things that how to create things that people will talk about it. And it's important. I don't say that it's not important, but
So from a business point of view, it is the most important thing is to actually stay in touch with your clientele and sort of like, give them what they want rather than like what you want to ship and have like some sort of balance in the middle. It actually is very important. Is it more important than actually beating the competition instead of like having something that's decisive? That's another question, right?
and also, you have the problem that they are losing money on each user that
Yeah.
actually use their product, right? So that's true. Like, you need more and more user, and at some point you hope to figure it out, right? You hope that you will understand how to make money from all these users and not just to lose billions of dollars.
Well, you mentioned losing money. I'll point out that right at this moment, we're seeing several movements that push towards monetization and for them to stop losing money per query. The GPT-5 router, even the whole like mini and micro series, nano series of models, but also now Anthropic just raised prices again, and now there's yet another
Really?
set of people crying on Reddit and everything's surprised about that fact. And so I think very few services going forward are going to offer below cost. Indeed, I also, as an ex-Oracle employee who's been watching Oracle kill it in the market since I was working there, people have been asking me, how the hell is Oracle doing so well? Why are they growing? A lot of it includes them probably being willing to run things at very close to, like, dangerously close to not profitable in terms of
Yeah.
the CPU space. That's why they were so much cheaper than other hyperscalers and still neoclouds, alongside close supply chain relations with NVIDIA, bare metal servers, etc. That's like real kind of thing. So I do think that exactly what you're saying, the push to monetization and that move quickly from, of platform decay that we witness, is even that alongside Jeff Bezos being like, we're in a bubble, saying it yes when he got asked, like, boldface. I'm getting a little worried right now in the sense of going, because we went from people not caring about LLMs, right? Nobody had heard of this term really even in 2022 except us nerds, right? And I say that affectionately, to the entire world obsessed with this, right? The entire economy having kind of reoriented. And that's all I'm going to say. Whoa.
The question is, what will be the next thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm sure that like thousands of people are trying to answer this question, right? In the big companies, mostly.
I mean,
Well,
at least half of the West Coast VCs, right?
and I'm hearing a lot of the people who have invested right now in LLMs asking me is like, so how's quantum doing? And I'm like, uh-oh, not the right question to be asking right now.
Alan, you're in the US. Invoke your Fifth Amendment right. It's okay. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, and I'll be like, it's doing about as well as nuclear fusion's doing right now.
To be fair, I worked a lot on sort of like quantum machine learning circa 2017 when I was in IBM still, when just like the Qiskit came out and you had like the first quantum computer. It is very interesting to see the field grow and actually sort of like grow more sober in the sense that like we're not gonna have like end-to-end quantum computing, but starting to have this kind of like hybrid accelerators for linear algebra, these kind of things. Like it is very interesting to see that actually that community is starting to understand a lot more friction with reality and sort of like get off the tree of some aspects. So you have things like Xanadu from out of Toronto that actually are doing photonic solutions. You have like Penny Lane, right? Like if you would ask me 5 years ago, like the fact that you have a end-to-end Python quantum machine learning library, open source, you can play with, you can run simple things. It's like, it's mind blowing. That being said, we're so far from to actually being like viable, but who knows?
Yeah, I think quantum computing is something that, you hear it from time to time, and every time like people say, yeah, this is like, we must put a lot of effort, but we are almost there. Like we just need to make better framework and like better, I don't know, bit better computing, and we will get there and we can solve like actual problems or like
No.
someone that actually, that someone actually cares about it. I hear it for, I don't know, the last 10 years. So
Yeah.
maybe at
No.
some point. I don't know. Okay, I want to mention a really cool paper that I read recently. It's called How to Train Your Advisor: Steering Black Box LLM with Advisor Model.
All right.
So this is from researchers at Berkeley mostly, and it's very cool. A very cool name, by the way. Really, I think one of the best names. And the idea is very simple. They just took a small model, like they train a small model that they call it like advisor, and that steer the big model after it, right? Like it just generate tokens. It's kind of like token optimization, right? Prompt optimization, if you want. And it generate tokens that you insert to the next model, like to the big black box model. And then you can say, then you train it with RL, and you have a model that you can steer it to whatever topic or domain that you. Very simple idea, very elegant idea, if you ask me. And I think this is something that can be very useful. Like there are so many cases that you can do, that you can tune and you can steer your big general purpose model. So if you have access to the weights and you actually can change it, or that's great. This is one option. The other option is to distill it, right, to a smaller model. This is another option. But they show here very elegant way to steer a model, and I think this is very useful because it's much more robust, right? You just train a small component that just add prompt to your big model, so you will not lose a lot of the general capabilities, but still you can say exactly like what is the best way to prompt your model. Anyway, I think the bottom line is that the advisors are still useful. I think this is my takeaway from this paper. Yeah.
Well, AI
Anything else?
steering is still one of the most important things, and it feels like there's so much published about it and so very little that makes it into the like engineering, like techniques that get you. I mean, yes, a lot in fine-tuning, post-training alignment. I don't deny that stuff, right? But in terms anything inference time steering, almost
Really?
very little of that. Well, when has ChatGPT or Claude, right, or any of them given you any steering beyond the prompt, right? I mean, Anthropic did on April Fool's Day with Golden Gate Claude, and that's it. They took it away as fast as they gave it to you, right? So
Interesting.
But I think this is, at the end, it would be the solution, right? Like this type of steering or another type of steering, it will be a solution for so many problems, right? It will be a solution. Now you have a very small problem. You're a startup that needs to solve a tiny problem in your process that you want an answer for your LLM, right? You can steer it and you can just, again, fine-tune it or distill it or whatever on this tiny problem. And if we can have this, dual use case, that from one hand we want very specific problems, we just want to add very specific problems, use cases to our general purpose model, it can unlock so many problems and use cases.
Sure.
Okay. Tal, what do you say? Do we want to talk about natural science and
And
AI?
sure, where to even start? Yeah, so just to give a bit of a background on sort of like how I got to this, I was actually trained as a theoretical physicist, where I
By the
had
way,
the
I think physicists are the best people to look on AI. All the physicists that I knew that worked on things that's related to AI, they had so much intuition and good intuition how to look on a problem and like what is the right level of abstraction that you actually need. I don't want to look on all the details, the dirty details that are doing
no,
weird
because
things. Yeah,
it's a very different type of science, right? Like in physics, usually you're used to sort of like think big, try to abstract it down, and then take a step like up again, sort of like switch between sort of formulating something that's very big and sort of very visionary to like, all right, how is that feasible? And let's break it down into like smaller problems. From there, like, all right, how do the smaller problems actually coalesce into like this sort of like bigger arc of progression and stuff like that. And just to sort of like foreshadow a bit into the future, where now I work a lot on like AI and the interface of like chemistry and physics, it's even more interesting as an advisor to work with the students, right? Because it's a very different scientific education that you have to work with them. Like, how do you formulate these kind of problems? How do you think about it? What's the toolbox that you need? It is. I found this very, very, very interesting, and I see this in my own group. So I have like a pillar of people that are working like very pure AI problems of like, hey, let's solve like game theory with neural networks, or so like, hey, let's do like RL and multi-agent systems. Then I have people who are working like, hey, let's see if like neural ODEs can help you with like chemical kinetics and stuff like that. And it is a very different sort of problem formulation and approach. If nothing else, because you need a very different base of knowledge, right? You need to know a bit of this, a bit of that. You need to know how they interface. But yeah, so just to close the loop, I was actually educated as a theoretical physicist, where I had the massive fortune to do my PhD under someone named Jeremy England, who sort of like actually left academia after a good chunk of time. Yeah, and afterwards I completely shifted into sort of very classical machine learning and deep learning. So I worked for a bit in IBM research in like healthcare and natural sciences and machine learning for healthcare, etc. And then I shifted back to academia, where I took a tenure track, and then I got tenured, and where I worked mostly in sort of like reinforcement learning, multi-agent systems, game theory, like, and very fundamental things. And in the last couple of years, I sort of completely shifted in really understanding this kind of very nice cycle between how can machine learning and deep learning solve problems in physics and chemistry and stuff like that. But more importantly, going to what you mentioned, Ravid, can we sort of start to use tools from theoretical physics and or like chemistry or like some pure math to actually understand how to understand machine learning and deep learning, right? Like this is still sort of magic. Like why are things happening? Is still something like that boggles me every time. Recently in the group, we really do treat this as like as a loop, because we have a lot of these things that like, oh, we managed to solve like a problem in chemistry using deep learning. Then like you can use this tool from chemistry to like actually craft a better network and really go through this cycle. And I'll say one last thing, that like it is to me also super interesting, because you can do a lot of like theory, and I use sort of like air quotes because you work on abstract topics. But end of the day, if you want to work in this community, if you don't give the experimentalist something that will help him, it won't get traction, right? That like that's your end user. So you are driven by doing theory that's very robust, but robust in the sense that like it has to generalize to real world scenarios. That is to me was the fascination that sort of like really drove me to it. I mean, that and 100 billion grant, €100 million grant that we got. But that's like on the small side.
But I must say that, like, right, they're different when you talk about like solving real world problems or like there
Yeah.
are several directions that you can take it. There's several like
Yeah.
ways you can say, okay, I want to solve natural science problems, and for that I'm using tools from deep learning, right? I'm trying to apply LLMs to natural science in order to find, I don't know, proteins or whatever, right? And you can say, or you can say I'm trying to take some understanding from protein folding, or like, I don't know, neural OD or whatever, in order to understand or even to get better models on AI
Yeah.
and
Well,
more common tasks. What do you think is more, let's say, interesting, or like what you are working on and you are more excited?
so that's a good question. Also, I think there's a bit of a lag. So sorry, I don't mean to like get into like the middle of the things. I think there is a whole class of problems in the middle that sort of like we haven't mentioned, which is how to facilitate high throughput experimentation. A lot of what you see recently is actually sort of not on the modeling side, but more on the hardware/robotics side. There's like this whole field of what's called self-driving labs that people are pushing very hard. That's what we're also working on, right? Because I remember like if there's one thing that COVID is, I don't know if we could talk about it. If there's something that COVID has shown us is just how crucial it is to have high throughput experiments. Like, we can visualize black holes, we can like solve protein folding, but you still have chemists that go like, like with a pipetting arm, like and
So you're trying to make more, like, that you can have more experiments in less time.
under feedback. So this is an important point, right? Like, because if you just say like, all right, I just want to like have a better experimentation protocol, that is sort of like a very classical industry optimization problem of like, I want to have better robotics, I want to have like sort of better platforms, etc. We're actually trying to take it a step further, and this is, I mean, I'm using the academic route, like me and a whole consortium of people that are working with this, and we're actually also trying to do this in a feedback loop with learning components, right? Like, can you actually do online changes through learning? Can you actually do scientific discovery on the fly? So doing the better automation, it's one vertical, but like it is a stepping stone to what we want, which is sort of at the end, truly a self-driving lab. That is one of the things that sort of going back to deep learning excites me a lot with what we see with like Alpha Evolve, with what sort of like some of the things coming out of Sakana, like sort of people pushing LLM for scientific discovery. I think it is absolutely mesmerizing. My gripe with this is that it's still very far from actually considering like the actual lab implication, considering how you would integrate it, going like into actually in vitro. And I can give like a few small anecdotes on these kind of things from the data perspective that we had in some recent projects, for example.
So let's start with what types of problems, what are the domains that you are trying
Yeah,
to solve?
yeah. So that's a good thing. I'll try and like sort of give some background just because various audience, different strokes for different folks. What I'm personally interested in, and this is like a very personal caveat, is in understanding dynamical processes. So a lot of the time people say like, oh, I want to understand how does water dissolve, or like I want to understand what is solubility of something, right? That is a static property in a sense. That's like you have mixture, you put it together, finish like, like spreading in the thing, measure it. I'm actually interested in like, for example, the diffusion process, the spreading, or I'm interested in, all right, something called chemical kinetics. So if you have like two atoms like going colliding to one another, like what is the formulation process? And that's a very hard problem for specifically for AI because it has the time component to it. Right? Like this is in a sense a somewhat of a time series problem because you're looking at a dynamical effect. It has the bane of our existence, which is lack of data. I think it's one thing that's very worthwhile to mention is that like acquiring real world data for chemical problems is massively expensive, right? Like I can't just spin up a mechanical toy. I need to go to the chemist and say like, hey, like run this for me, which is interesting. So I'm super interested in these kind of like dynamical problems of like formulation, chemical kinetics, catalysis, because I think these are the drivers to some of our biggest problems now, like batteries, like I said, like emulsions, like sort of like a lot of things that on the day to day, we want to either discover new things or sort of like have better routes to mass produce them. These are like the critical missing scientific components that we have there.
Again, there are two different problems here. One is to
Yeah.
try to understand it, right? Like to understand the
Yeah.
process, the diffusion process or whatever. And that's fine. Like now you need probably to collect a lot of data in order to fit a model to it, right? Or like to solve a lot of equations and then to fit a model. But another problem is to actually to generate new materials or like to generate new data
100%.
or like to make it more efficient to collect this data. So what you
100%,
are
100%. So I'm on the first part right now, mostly because again, this is our like start of our journey. Of course, we would love to go into the second part and we have some thoughts about it. But for us, it really is, even to make it a bit more crisp, is sort of like, how can I have, for example, what's called molecular dynamics, which is what people use to actually simulate molecular systems. That's facilitated by deep learning, right? Like that's the major sort of driver of my group now. A classical example that you can have is we sort of recently have a very nice paper where we looked at what's called a chemical reaction network. So a chemical reaction network is literally a thing about like a graph that we all know and love from computer science, where at each node you have like a different sort of type of subset of chemicals, and the graph actually maps their transformation, right? So we have, but the biggest difference is that it's not a static graph. It's what's called a dynamical graph, in the sense that like it's a graph of kinetics, and like how one material changes into the other. And it's not so clear that it's actually is a closed one, because most of the time it's sort of like, all right, these are things that we manage to measure in the lab, or these are things that we can hypothesize can formulate and stuff like that. I'm saying this because just to sort of like wrap it up, you can create equivalence between like graphs and chemical problems. Why am I rambling on with this? Because we managed to sort of like in the same way that you can formulate neural ODEs, and we talked about it earlier, as a form of computational graph that you sort of like tack on a universal approximator on it, actually use this as a discovery mechanism or understanding mechanism, not exactly discovery, we'll talk about it, for new transition states for given data. So what ended up happening is like we had some chemicals, we poured them in, we started measuring some of the kinetics. We have like a part of the kinetical process.
This is real data, you mean?
This is
like
real data.
you
This is
actually
like
measure
real
it.
data. We actually
Okay.
measure it. Well, to William Huck's group in Radboud that actually did the experiments. This is like you know, like they don't allow me to the lab anymore after the first or second exposure. No, just kidding. This is like credit to William for actually like measuring real world data that they measured, where they had the reaction networks, which means that like they have the rate constant. So how does one chemical change into another, right? And they formulated it as a graph, and through neural ODs, we actually in the universal approximator that we tack on this sort of like reaction graph, we actually managed to find some rates for transition states that weren't fully known. So that's why when you said like, do you want to do like modeling or do you want to do generative AI, it was sort of like, all right, it was actually a bit of a middle ground, especially when you talk about the natural sciences, is that you don't have to discover like something completely new, but even through understanding of new relationships, you can get a lot. You can really learn a lot. And that is sort of like some things that really excite me in this field. And that's why I say like AI facilitated molecular dynamics or
So just to see that I fully understood. So like someone collect data about some interaction between molecules, right? And then you say, okay, I know how to, I will try to formalize it, and I will try to structure it as neural ODEs, right? It's like I know the equations, I know how they evolve and things like that. And then I will take it and I will put it on a graph, use it and take the data. Yeah, you correct me.
No, like it's very like there's one solid thing on a computational graph. And the reason is because all of these kind of like dynamical effects, you formulate as differential equations, right? And that is what you break as the graph, like the differential equations, because that's what you can tack on a universal approximator, and that's why sort of like you can use it. So that's why it's a mechanism discovery. It's very important because if you just write like the relationship graph with all this interconnectedness, you won't learn as much as actually writing the graph for the differential equations, for the actual dynamics. That's where the learning comes from. And to me, that is the fascinating part, that you can do
Why,
this.
like, I can understand that, like, we want to understand the mechanism behind something, but, like, does it helpful for other use
Yeah,
cases? Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
can you generalize to different scenarios?
Well, even much simpler, right? A lot of the time, what ends up happening is that you do what's called a phase diagram. So you have some sort of space of like species, for example, and you know, like here I have this compound, here I have this compound, here I have this compound. Measuring all of it is sort of very, very, very expensive. But if you have ways to start interpolating things, especially where it's very hard to measure, you can start to narrow down your experimental scope, right? Like now I want to rebalance to this area. Now I want to use this kind of like percentage or any kind of apparatus, right? So even before sort of like actually going into like this full blown like, oh, I discovered a new thing, just as a facilitator to like here there's gold is also super important.
But how much you have, you're using, like, let's say, classical theory from, I don't know, 50 years ago versus more recent models. And because, like, the process that you describe right now, like, you're not using modern AI models, right?
Yeah, so this was the beautiful thing about it. So what do you define as modern? We definitely don't bust out transformers and stuff like that. What was actually to me very mind blowing is it very simple and small, like MLPs or LSTMs as part of like the universal approximator on the neural Ds. You can get a lot of insight, and you can actually converge and find sort of like very unique states. Also, biggest sort of like eye opener, especially having this one field in the group where like let's bust out LLM to try like game theory reasoning, and then like below 7 or 70B nothing moves, and then you have one student that says like 10K model sort of like gives me amazing results, like parameter inflation galore. But so the methodology is not, there isn't massive innovation in the architectures or the algorithms that you use. It's more about crafting the problem together, about this understanding that like, hey, I have a part that I can formulate as like classical chemistry, like differential equations. I have this knowledge of like neural ODs. I know universal approximators should give me this. And if I'm looking for discontinuities, I can look at this kind of network. If I look at like a universal approximator for something new or like smooth analysis, sure, I can do it. So it's not about like having this massive sort of like latest and greatest on each of these. It's about really taking the understanding from all the fields and tying it together. Going back to the remark I said that like it's a bit of a different set of skills that you have to work with the students, because you really have to sort of like understand what you want to solve and like what do the tools mean.
And do you think if tomorrow will be a better model? I don't know. It doesn't have to be the best LLM that achieve, the state of the art on some data set. But i- do you think if now I will have model that better describe something, it can be helpful? Or like you say, I don't care about like the actual models. Like this LSTM is enough because
Yeah,
it's universal approximation
yeah.
approximator.
So it's an important point. I think that will highly depend on the problem you're trying to solve. My gut intuition is that like when you want to go to like full blown generative discovery of new materials, there it will really matter. And to be honest, I think like we're gonna have to go back to the drawing table and think about like some new foundation model or world model. When you want to talk about what I call sort of like discovery or enlightenment or like whatever you want of like just understanding data, understanding real world scenarios and seeing what you're missing in between the line and what's interesting there, I honestly think there it's more on the data side than the model side. So I'm a big advocate of um, instead of having massive amounts of data, like in the culinary scene where you have like farm to table, like have like data to model. And I can give a very funny anecdote. So we have another paper where we used an LLM to actually do predictions of chemical properties, static, like solubility. How much does like salts solute in water, right? And what we found there is that the more we used different data sets together, more data actually equals like worse results. Why is that? Because what ended up happening, and it's very interesting, is that like each lab collected the data with the same protocol under different ambient conditions, and actually combining them gave us like worse predictions. So when we
Okay, I will say that I'm strongly disagree with your view. So I think the problem here, right? The problem is that like they didn't align the data, they didn't calibrate it. But I think these are like solvable things, and you can solve it. And I think the most important thing, if you ask me, so you have two parts. One is the data that I think I'm a big fan of. As much as you can, give me as much as possible data that you have, right? I will solve all these calibration problems and things like that. I think it's much simpler to solve them. And the second one is compression.
that I
If someone knows my
100% with you.
work, I'm a
100% with you.
huge fan of compression, and I think compression is actually can do all
Agree.
these tricks that will prevent from overfitting to all the weird thing that you have in your data. So give me as much as possible data, I will compress it, and it will be fine. Don't worry about architecture, models, all these details are not
All right,
metrics.
so on that I partially agree. I'll take data quality over quantity, especially in the natural sciences, as much as I can. If I can have a very coherent protocol where I sort of like at least can control or remove all of the confounders, give me as much data as you can. Sadly, especially when it comes to these kind of like natural science problems like chemistry, like physics and stuff like that, that's usually very hard because, like, again, going back to like, why do we need high throughput experiments? Because you want with the same lab in the same protocol to punch out as much data as you can, reducing
But
these
what is the
confounders.
problem? Why we don't have the same protocols for different labs? What is is there any fundamental problem? Like at the end, right, you measure,
Yeah,
again, I don't understand anything
no,
on measuring and things like that.
sure.
But what is the problem? Like you have, let's assume that even I have like the same machine, right? Or like different machines, but like same, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think we can
So
standardize this, but is there another problem that I'm not aware?
yeah. So there are a couple of things. I don't know how much this is interesting or not interesting to the audience, but it is sort of like a nice
High
discussion.
level. Let's talk about it in high
Yeah.
level.
So high level. Let's start from just like scientific issue where actually no one really reports the protocol fully, or like sort of like the small variants. I love this when like like I went and shadowed like some of the experimental chemists, and like they do the protocol, and then suddenly I see them lift and like mix this for 2 rounds. I'm like, hey, this wasn't in what you wrote in the protocol. What's going on? It says like, yeah, when there's a lot of light, I see some segmentation, and like I know I need to steer it, right? So like it's the fact that you still have so much human in the loop as well. Like the machinery is very robust. And if it would be end-to-end machinery, that's awesome, which is exactly what we're striving to do. But you still have so much human factor in it that you will have variability. That's one. The second is that what ends up happening is that if you want to be a real explorer and do new things, everyone will do their own like small add-ons to the experimental procedure. They will expand the machine. They will do sort of like craft their own sort of add-ons with 3D printing and stuff like that. And that's very non-transferable when someone else says like, hey, like now I want to do this or want to continue this. So they sort of like redo this themselves because they don't commercialize it immediately. And then from there, it's sort of like, the drift of the error.
Is it because like we don't have enough sophisticated machines, right? Because I can imagine a robot that do all these actions one in a time, right? These
Well,
are not like very difficult actions at the end. Like you need to put this here and this there and like all these things. Like
so
these are very routine actions, right?
not necessarily. Like what you're describing is in a sense are sort of like what driven what we want to do. So there are two issues. A lot of it is that like the experiments are adaptive somewhat in the sense of like depending on the measurement of the first stage, you have to take a different decision on the second, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is level of feedbacks that you have to take into account. And that is actually very hard to fully automate. That is exactly the kind of things that we're sort of like striving and like even go from feedback to sort of like guidance, right? And like actually have adaptability on the fly. But what you're describing is sort of exactly the pain point that we are in this sort of like, it's called a growth fund, like huge RoboLab consortium are trying to solve. And why we're so bullish on sort of AI, like the context switching between AI in the middle and like human in the middle processes for end to end. It's like exactly why we're so bullish on this integration of AI in this field, because it really is in a sense behind on the experimental side, on the modeling side, on like a lot of things. On a personal note, it also is very nice to work in a field that you can take your time and think about a problem, right? Like I don't have to punch out a paper every like month deadline on this field, and like because it takes time working with the experimental data, doing this kind of like more fundamental modeling, understanding where it comes from, etc., etc.
But how, like at the end, how can you count on a data that it's really difficult to reproduce? Like it's really difficult to I don't know. You don't know the variance, right? Like between you know it's a huge variance between different people. So how can you even try to model it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. This is where it comes to like a bit of the subtlety of like our hope as we go more and more into this like self-driving labs and like autonomous sort of like scientific discovery. This will in a sense enforce some sort of standardization that you're slowly taking the humans out of the loop. That is one thing. The second is that this is exactly why we want this delicate balance between first sort of like interpretability or understanding through AI of like internal mechanisms, and then transitioning into more generative models of actually augmenting. Because to me, sort of as funny as it sounds, generative AI is fantastic in the sense that you can narrow a bit the scope of generation up to some variance at least. And that is like a fantastic tool. If it's good or not to like start to train on Gen AI data for this kind of natural sciences problem, that is a whole discussion. But you are right. It's like you're gonna be sort of like an issue, right? And I want to give one last comment is that like data sets, like this community, we're starting to see like a move toward it, but it's very far behind of like publishing data sets. No one does that. It is a very, very small thing. And now it's starting to grow, right? Like we're doing this very strongly now. We have like 3-4 data sets that we generated that were sort of like now starting to interact with like Hugging Face and some things to start to push them. That is the biggest bane of our existence, going back to what you're saying. There's just like no public data sets in this field as much.
Yeah, I agree. I think like data at the end, this is also when you train LLMs, right? Like almost no one actually published the data. And we know that the secret is in the data, right? Like how you do it, how you filter, how you generate, how you make all the weird tricks that people are doing.
Exactly. So
Yeah, I was just going to also point out on this whole concept of physics, right, informing machine learning, right? I mean, the very concept of a tensor is a physics concept first, I think, right? I mean, and when you're talking about, like solving ODEs, right? I believe they start calling some of the techniques statistical mechanics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a few comments. I mean, like even scaling laws, right? Like we had scaling laws to phase transitions and all these like universality like 60 years ago, and Kadanoff got like Nobel, like, the sort of like there's a lot of these things that diffused or were taking inspiration. And somehow when we moved into this kind of like scale first and dominant paradigm, we put it a bit on the back burner. I want to give a shout out to, for example, Frank Sipulinsky, that had a mountain of very beautiful work on exactly sort of taking concepts from physics and starting to try and understand neural network. I see Ravid smiling already.
Yeah, maybe we'll come to the podcast. I'm trying to.
That's the wet dream. That would be amazing. Time is like the scientific role model for all of my generation, I think.
Yeah.
And it's a high role model. But yeah, Alan, like there is a lot of things that you can there. We have this whole field of like physics inspired neural networks and all these things as well.
But I will say, but one more thing that, like, I don't know, I think scaling laws is a good example of how people take some term from physics and just, I don't know, make it like just change the whole meaning, like make it like almost meaningless, right? Like, what does it mean scaling laws these days in LLMs? Like, if it depends on everything and you don't know what you need to take into account on why to have scaling laws, right? So, right, you have nice graphs and nice figures as in physics, but it doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah, I mean, people are starting to use these concepts also as tooling, right? Like you have this wonderful package called Weight Watchers. I don't know if you ever sort of like played around with it. That tells you, it basically tries to actually use scaling law. It doesn't say it exactly, but like try to use this kind of scaling laws as a form of self-regularization and tell you if layers are like undertrained, overtrained, based on deviation from theoretical scaling laws that you would have. So there are people. It's Charles. I forgot Charles' last name, but it really is like amazing work what he's doing with Weight Watchers. So you do have people that are trying to like steer it back into its original meaning. But yeah, like as a theoretical physicist, for me, thinking about scaling or thinking about all these concepts, it's like it's not. I lost all my intuition recently as soon as it got appropriated into like the AI world fully in some aspects.
I want to go back, like, because I have a question. So you said it like you think you don't know if we can have actually like a good generative models for science. And I want to maybe to ask you like, do you think so? In images we have great generative models. In text we have great generative models. Why you think science will be different, or do you think
Yeah.
science
So
will
I
be
think
different?
so.
Natural
So again, like
sciences.
just like data issues. Like you're just so limited. Like diffusion models are like usually very data hungry. That's one thing. The other thing is that like you're starting to hit similar roadblocks to what we had with like going back to SOAR and all these things of like actually for learning generative material design, right? You don't want to just like learn a new material because it doesn't tell you anything about if it's functional or not. You can generate whatever material you want. If it actually has functionality or like it actually is sort of useful, will depend a lot on like we started saying, like its formation process or like its dynamical things. And that goes into like having a generative model that literally respects the physical laws or some of these sort of like more causal effects, right? The classical example is proteins, right? If I know like the starting point, if I know like the end point, that's okay. But that doesn't tell me as much about discovery or doing new things as the process itself. And that's something that is like always been massively hard to generate models, right? That is like my biggest excitement about Sora 2 and all these things is like, all right, we're starting to make headways with generative modeling that can encapsulate these kind of like physical laws. Can we start to take it into the natural sciences? That is to me like the most exciting thing about it.
Yeah, this is why I think JEPA style models are very
Are
useful, right?
fantastic. Yeah.
So JEPA style models, joint embedding models, joint
Yes.
embedding prediction models. That the idea is that you are not like you separate between the prediction process or the generation process to the learning process, and you can learn embedding that are actually useful. And you can do it for text, images, whatever, which domain that you want. And the promise or like the goal is to have a model that have some kind of like internal model that they
Yeah.
actually understand something more fundamental about the world or about the scenarios.
I'm so with you. Something very active that we are trying to do now in the group is sort of like actually use this kind of, instead of embedding, but internal world models from, for example, classical simulators, where we have sort of like this loop between something like fluid dynamic engine or like sort of like molecular dynamics or any kind of thing that we can sort of use some sort of inductive bias that is actual and natural science problem, like loop that into models, right? But that's like very, very, very initial things. And it's hard. It's actually very, very hard to embed it once it's not just like some sort of text data or tabular or like things that, because it's non-stationary, it has a lot of issues of causality. You don't have a lot of like data to work with to begin with. Usually when you generate things, generating things that are actually functional is very rare or very hard, at
What do
least
you
in the
mean? Can
field
you
that I'm in.
explain?
Yeah. So that's a good point. Like I think proteins is the classical example of like, its geometrical orientation will determine all of its functionality. When you start to talk about like not just like long proteins, things like organic compounds or like semi-organic or inorganic compounds, you can generate like a polymer with 1,000 different variations, but out of which the one that is actually something that you can synthesize in the lab, like actually create and actually has some sort of functionality that you want, like soaps, right? Or like this can like help me cook better, or like taste, or things like that. That is very, very, very hard. You can generate whatever you want, but if it actually like this structure has the properties that you are looking for, that is a massive difference.
But is it like, so I don't know, like a physical problem that like we don't understand how the molecules are working together, or is it something that like
Yeah.
like good or bad, like that it tastes good or like is sweet or something like that? This is also like it's related to humans, right? How human
Yeah.
think about it. So like, but these are two different problems, right?
Yeah. So that's why I specifically said like functionality, right? Like for example, you want to generate a molecule that is like a soap, which means that it has one part that's organic, one part that has some sort of like hydrogen and oxygen on it, that like one end like binds to the water, one to the dirt, and like it washes away, right? Um, where exactly will this sort of like oxygen, hydrogen, and be what it's surrounded with, and like some of the geometrical stuff, or even just like the rest of the tail super matters to its effectiveness. It won't always be as good. And those are things that are actually very hard to infuse into Gen AI, because like the diffusion model will generate whatever you want. How do you give it context of like, all right, in my training samples, these also add this kind of properties. It's there. That is the massive issue. Like that is the biggest problem. Like when you generate images, that doesn't have this subtlety of like, I need the image to be grounded. If you talk about movies and
Yeah.
Sora and all these things, that's where it gets grounded. That's sort of like is again what so excites me about having these massive advancements with Sora and Genie, because you can finally start to ground these things.
Right. Again, like there is like, okay, so if you want to generate soap, right? So it says the functionality that cleaning. Okay, that's fine. Like let's assume that you know like how to do it and to say, okay, if a molecule is act as cleaning or not, right? This is one thing. But another thing, now I want to generate something that is tasty for humans, right?
Yeah,
How
that
I'm
is a
going to do
whole other
that?
problem.
Right.
And
This is like a much major problem, right? Because like, I don't know, like it can be anything and every human has its own interpretation.
yeah, even about something very similar, right? Like here, you guys are in the US, I'll give you this example. Like if you want to have a beer that you then want to make it like non-alcoholic, but with the exact same taste as the alcoholic beverage, that is actually a massive hard problem, because you need human tasters, you need all these kind of things, right? I think DeepMind had this work a year ago or something about like, but actually like trying to sort of like do olfactory like or smell based sort of neural network detection and stuff like that. Like I 100% agree with you that that's like as soon as like you have to both condition on like a label of functionality, but one that is like sort of like very human context dependent, that is a whole other issue. That is where we sort of like are hoping to not just go on the modeling side, but really into this like kind of self-driving lab. Because if you can like punch through some sort of like 10,000 experiments of somehow quantifying it in like a single day, you're golden, because it is about like churn of experimentation and sort of moving, especially on these kind of like subjective things, which is again.
So do you think RL is the way to go in this in order to solve it?
You want to take me into that landmine? Field, I think RL would have a very strong foothold in this, just because policy function, and to be honest, there is a very nice mapping between how we think about policies and something called free energies and some aspects of physics. Like it's a natural object to start to do this modeling. If it's like the classical RL that we have now, we're like, oh, PPO, this policy stuff, maybe. But it is going to be like a very active component in it, right? Especially in things relating to similar to like RLHF, exactly for this kind of like alignment of human behavior. Yeah, for
But
sure.
like, so we talked about it a bit last week with Ahmad. So there is kind of like big difference between what people call like classical RL, right? That like you have, I don't know, an agent that working the
Bandits and stuff
world
like
and
that, or
Right,
Okay.
and like try to estimate a value function, and like do you have exploration, exploitation, like all these things versus what we actually doing today with LLMs, right? With RL
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
LLMs.
Yeah. So this is important.
So what do you
So to
think? Like,
me,
so yeah, what do you think is the way to go in this case? Do you
yeah.
think like
So again,
LLMs, like RL in LLMs, is good direction, or you think like we need more general framework that we actually can explore and get feedback?
okay. So again, I'm sort of like I'm a chemist with the illusion of grandeur, or like a physicist that learned to bark for his grants, right? So I'm gonna give you like a bit of a different interpretation of where do I look at it. I think that just the RL component is truly fantastic in the sense of it will come in as an active component in accelerating some of our simulation methods and some of our things that we're looking as a reproduction of dynamically processed in the lab. Why? Because a lot of these problems are about sort of like efficient sampling of multi-scale things. For example, if I look at like water is a classical example. I have the oxygen, I have the hydrogen, they have different weights, they vibrate on different scales, like sort of like modeling these kind of things is very, very, very hard. And RL can be like, we have like 30 years of important sampling, and we have policy that we can learn how to counterbalance and things. So I think helping and accelerating this kind of like discovery from the classical chemistry methods, RL would be like very, very, very powerful. The LLMs, it's a bit trickier, and that's sort of like my own personal bias, is that I think about it in the sense that the autoregressive nature can be very strong in predicting time series, in predicting sort of like transition states, and having actually arriving at one state of like a confirmation or like a transition state, stuff like that, and then sort of like advancing it properly into the next step. The autoregressive nature is going to be the helper. And the reason why I'm mentioning an LLM and not any like other thing is because if it's big enough and it does have scaling laws, and we'll talk about it in a second about scaling laws, it means that it can generalize and it can sort of have predictive powers to things that you haven't fully seen. Now, a lot of this is a personal view. When people talk about scaling laws in this context, to me, it's about self-similarity and conservation of information over many scales. And I think that's a very crucial component when you start to talk about this kind of like natural science predictive problem. So I have a view on like each of these by itself can sort of very strongly help. If there are people PhD sort of like that want to come and see how do you put this together, come join the group. But like it is an active question of like where do these two sort of interface? It's an open one. It's a beautiful open one.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a great question. Like scaling, both in LLMs, but in general in models and AI models, and it's something that like it has a long history how it emerged, right?
Yeah.
In science and like in the real world, right? And I think this is at the end, it's maybe the fundamental problem, like or the fundamental question. In what scale do you look on the problem?
Yeah, there's an argument on some of the stuff that we're doing in the group in natural science of like that I give students in scaling laws is it's a bit off topic, but it's a nice example. If you think about like fractals, so you have what's called like the triangular fractal that like in each triangular, you sort of like body another triangle, etc. When you want to ask what is the dimension of this, you actually derive a scaling law because you say like, all right, in a box, how many of these do I encapsulate, right? So that's a fractal with perfect self-similarity that has a scaling law. But you have things like random networks. You have things that are sort of like completely chaotic randomness, and those two also have a scaling law. So it's more about sort of like what is the variation between the different scales of the emerging phenomena, right? And what is the information preservation or transformation between the different scales? And that is sort of like really what excites me about busting these tools for natural sciences, because it's such a perfect match, right? But it's hard. That's why we're doing research on this.
But do you think is it possible to find, right? Like to
I
define
think
the
so.
yeah?
I truly so again, like maybe it's blind faith, maybe it's like grand stupidity. I truly, truly, truly think so. It is I think it will manifest only when you don't have like full LLM, like I'm just taking this massive transformer and busting it out. My sort of intuition tells me is that when we start to think about smarter inductive biases, that we can incorporate that respect physical laws, things like what's called symplectic solvers in geometry, or things like energy conservation, or things like sort of like momentum, stuff like that. I think that's gonna be the key. The key is about sort of like taking the LLMs, keeping some sort of scaling hypothesis, but on an architecture with inductive biases that are actually respecting real physics.
But it's not so. So I think text is different from physical signals
Yeah.
because again, like you can handwave that you have this hierarchy of words and paragraphs and pages, but
Yeah.
things like that. But at the end, for physical signals, you have physical laws, right? Like you have the molecules that everything built on the top of it, and you have the atoms, and you have objects, and you have things that like you have real levels of hierarchies and real levels of scaling. So do you think the solution should be different between text and other physical signals?
So again, there's, by the way, a wonderful book called The Atoms of Language. It's a whole field, right, that thinks about like language as complex systems. I think there is like a parallel. The solution concept will be the same. The scale, like, will we need like 70B model for this? I truly don't think so. That also is, again, like why I'm so excited about Alexia's new work of like a smaller foundation model. Like there is no way that it's going to be like a scale phenomena. And by scale, I mean like massive network. It's going to be about like a smarter architecture that actually respects it. That's going to be the key difference. Text is like, well, you do this, like the classical example is like self-supervised, right? Like you train all of these, like, well, you did more work on this than me. Like if you do like self-supervised for text, that's okay. I take a sentence, I start to omit, I minimize the distance, right? But like if I take a molecule, like which molecule I omit completely changes it, right? Like that's what I mean, that you're going to have to rethink.
And what is the right distance?
Yeah, like or like, is this the right approach? So I can tell you that like one trick that we found is actually taking a data set of what's called smiles, which is like a representation, string representations of molecules, taking a subset of the data set and like permute it and have this kind of like very weird loss where you pick two random molecules from the data set and you sort of mix and match and say like, is this a permutation of one another or not, even a binary? Even these kind of things sort of like massively help us because it reduced the rotational invariance or like permutation of strings. Yeah.
What's the relationship of this to stoichiometry?
So that is a whole other issue. So stoichiometry, for people who don't know, sort of like is the basically the geometrical. So you can have like either think about the geometrical representation of it, or sort of like, all right, how much oxygens, how much molecules, like how much hydrogens I have in this thing. So important point, Adam. You actually have to give the entire molecule as a smile. Like you can't do compressed representation. That is actually part of the biggest reasons that we have in encoding things like polymers, where you want to talk about compression. So polymer is that you have a massively long sort of chain of the same repeated units. So what people usually do in chemistry, they say like, oh, I have like brackets like 4. These kind of things are actually like very hard to encapsulate, and someone did like Alan Guznik did something called selfies, which is like a way to represent it. But like going back to your question, a lot of the models today, like it's very hard because you either need like perfect compression, one repeated unit, two repeated units, and saying how much, or you give the entire thing, having things like branches, like, okay, this goes up, this goes down. You want to talk about language, like I don't have like that cat, like trees up and then like jumps it down. Like it doesn't have geometrical representation that you need to encapsulate, right? That's what I think. I don't know if that answered your question, but like you actually have to give the full-blown description. For us, doing this loss of the permutation was more about like having an error of like, all right, if I have a molecule, I can permute it in something that's actually physically viable, like that's not complete garbage, and like trying to reduce like variations that are not sort of just full nonsense.
Okay, we need to finish, but I have one more question. So,
Yeah,
like to
go
conclude,
for it.
after we did all these journeys together, do you think that it's possible to have a perfect or near perfect simulation that actually can be useful to discover both new materials and also new functionality, or like to understand their functionality.
Yes, I truly. So with a cigarette packet warning of like, what is a simulation? It's like actually taking some sort of physical law and running it on the computer. I 100% agree. Yes, I'll take it even a step back. That like right now, the classical sort of simulation is like, all right, I take Newton's equations and like I run it forward in time and like I generate data through a force field or something. I think really the future is very similar to some stuff we started working on, where like it doesn't have to be just fully Newton's equation. Maybe there is sort of a way to tackle a universal approximator and like have data-driven approaches to do this kind of discovery. This is exactly what I mean by like a physics-inspired inductive bias to the problem. This is like super important.
And what is the time scale that you think we will have it?
Wow, on record, like
No
I
one,
want
no
to
one
say like
listen to it. That's fine.
yeah, everyone is to it. No, like I think like whatever I'm thinking about, I'll take 2 years off. Like, but I think because just the rate is like every time I think like this is not gonna happen, and then Guznik from Toronto is like does this. So and other people. No, I think like we're very closely, like 2 years, 2.5 years, because there is also there is finally a massive presence from industry in these fields. You have Cusp, you have Cradle. Isomorphic is like pushing hard, right? Like you have so many now sort of like innovation pickers or contributors from industry that like timelines are accelerating. And to be honest, I think that is the most exciting sort of field if you really want to be on, because you're in the promised land. You have all of the technology and all of the open questions.
Okay, so if you're a PhD student, like you want to do a PhD, you know what problems to try to solve, right? Do you want to say anything, something, I don't know, about like to advertise something, self-promotion, whatever you want?
Yeah, so I'll give the non sort of typical self-promotion of like I'm very lucky that I'm tenured, so I don't really need to promote myself. But there is a fantastic cohort of students that sort of like come and teach me something new every day that I'm super grateful. So like I have a website, all the students are there. Like reach out to them, read the papers. I think what they're doing is super innovative. All of them are sort of like always looking around and looking to talk to people that sort of learn new science. And again, like I really wanna not advertise, but push sort of the younger researchers to go to like more promising sort of like green fields that are not in the mainstream, because I think that's what we need now, and that's sort of like is the most beautiful science you can do, and just enjoy the problems you're doing. And so yeah,
Totally agree. Tal, thank you so much.
thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, and thank you, Ellen.
It was always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you for all the people that listening. See you next week. Bye bye.
Next week. Bye bye.